Everyone, I'm here to go over basically like a new style of Uzuri. The main reason why is because Oldhim LLing out of Classic Constructed is going to kind of change a bunch of stuff. So we're also going to cover Dash. I'm not sure in what order I'll upload these, but Dash is also getting a pretty big overhaul, and Hybrid Dash is pretty much going to be put on the back burner for now in terms of testing, mainly because with Oldhim leaving, there's just a lot of new strategies that you can try out now, and there's a elephant in the room that you no longer have to deal with, and that was often really taxing in deck construction. So previous Uzuri lists that I made on the channel, so the contract list, had to respect Oldhim a lot. So we're going to jump into a new style of Uzuri today, where we're going to be kind of blending a little bit of the aggression and disruption of the red line decks. So this would be something that was played by Sam Dando, that was brewed by Ben Dodd, and a lot of other people have also covered it. I know, I believe it's Colin Swisher, I believe from Baltimore as well. There's a lot of people out there who have done really well with these red line versions of it, where they don't really play contracts. They are trying to utilize the self swap for relevant 2 costs, things like that, to cheat them into play. And then there was versions, myself and Archon Altars list, as well as some others out there as well, that were more focused on contracts. And this was trying to use Mask of Perdition for lots of value, grinding people out through the contract banishes, and leveraging your life total with the silver generation. I believe this also was played at Baltimore by Tao Tao. Why would we bother mixing them is the question. The main reason why is because Ranger, specifically Lexi, if Lexi's not nerfed but the banner restricted, is probably one of the best decks in the format. And regardless, the thing too is that Uzuri feels like she is meant to be an answer to aggro. And what I mean by that is that a lot of her cards attack the hand. They're poor value rates, but the idea is that the disruption that you gain from the card hitting is more impactful than the numbers itself. The most obvious answer would be Shakedown, right? A 2 for 6. Why would we play a 2 for 6 in 2023, right? Well, the answer is that if you banish a card and you're playing against a very fragile strategy that wants to keep really aggressive cards that need to be played in a certain order or in a certain sequence, then at the very least, maybe you're able to get a 0 for 4, right? And then you've protected yourself from 4 damage while also dealing 6 to the opponent. But it goes even further than that, because some decks actually need that specific card to make the rest of their turn work, right? So if, for instance, you take away the non-attack from the Briar, maybe they can't get an Embodiment of Lightning anymore, maybe Rosetta Thorn is off, and you're saving yourself way more than the value of the card, right? For instance, the most obvious example is you attack Viserai. Viserai kept a blue, a Shrill, and a Mauvrion Skies. And if you take any one of those cards, their entire turn shuts down. Because of that, Uzuri feels like a really good answer to aggro. She doesn't feel that good into mid-range strategies that want to be blocking proactively while also sending efficient trades back, because your efficient trades, quote marks, are worse most of the time. If you're running against something like Ice Center, for example, you don't really have many 2-card 8s. A lot of that is because the Spider's Bites are just horribly inefficient. The problem is if you're playing against some strategies that are comfortable blocking partially and they deny those, then it's a lot different, right? Wounded Bull is an 8 regardless if you block it or not, whereas, for example, something like Infect in red, right, is a 0 for 5, but only if they don't block it. So if they do block it for 3, you played a 0 for 3 and you and your opponent are in even exchange. So there are just better mid-range decks, for example, things like Reinar, things like Dash, that just have vanilla numbers that are just better, and they're not conditional on whether your opponent blocked, whether or not you got an attack reaction in. Uzuri feels more at home when the meta becomes super hyper aggressive and decks need to keep 4 to 5 card hands and not block to really function. Then all of a sudden she becomes so much better because she pretty much forces your opponent to block every turn. So let's actually jump into what this list is. So the reason why we're running contracts is because into decks where you're proactively disrupting, contracts offer a second form of disruption and a secondary win con where you can run your opponent out of cards. The contracts are a better rate, in my opinion, than some of the stealth reds. Additionally, running your opponent out of cards is actually really important, and you'll find a lot of the times in a list like this, the banished cards actually do matter. Especially first cycle, if you're able to banish relevant cards, key cards, for instance, from some heroes, you can actually swing games only off of that alone. Fab is a game where seeing every card matters, and so removing those cards from your deck actually gives you a much stronger win percentage rate than, for instance, something like Magic or any other TCG where you draw about 1 card a turn and don't really have any strong filter or tutor effects. That stuff really adds up over time. And so we are still on those because of the value rate, but then also there's a lot of matchups, for instance, like Ranger, Katsu, we can go on, especially things like, Dash as well, even Reinar. We're just banishing over time if you don't have another relevant card. So if you can block 9 and send a contract, that's enough. That's all you need. I believe in this list, we are on a total of 18 contracts, including Eradicate. So if we Let's not even take Mask into account here. And let's say Eradicate only banishes 1 card. Let's say they block it for 3 and it only takes away 1 card from deck. We're looking at least 18 cards that we can potentially remove from the opponent's deck. So we're looking at a third of their deck gone. The name here of Bravo Cosplay, the idea of Bravo is that Bravo can actually fatigue fairly comfortably, even in matchups where he's aggressive, because what happens is that the opponent goes too low and the Bravo just presents such tall attacks that your opponent has to lose so many cards from deck that even though they're still alive and they're still training back, they pretty much have almost no way to really win because they're just losing too many cards in every single exchange. And so that's kind of the idea here, is being an aggressive, disruptive deck that has a secondary game plan of just fatiguing out your opponent because you're removing so many cards from deck, or your effects are just forcing too many cards out of your opponent, or they're losing too many from arsenal, things like that. We'll just go down the list here. The most interesting inclusion here might be Come to Fight. I haven't seen it in a whole lot of other lists. The main reason why is because you're just able to use it really cleanly with a lot of these more disruptive attacks. So we'll jump down the sideboard a little bit early. We're running Humble, cut down to size, even things like Surgical coming in for 7. I understand it's worse than something like a Red Shred or a Pump, let's say like Cut to the Chase if we're in contracts, but the thing is here, it's just universal on everything. You can Tunic into any of the contracts, any of the 0 costs, so like E-Strike, things like that. And the reason, in my opinion, why it's better than Nimblism is being able to Blue Pitch Command and Conquer for 9 or Blue Pitch Shakedown for 9 while threatening any reaction. Super strong to me. The other thing too is being able to, let's say, Dagger with Tunic up, play the Come to Fight, and then Codex in, let's say, Death Touch and send it. Is also massive. You can Blue Pitch to play it, Codex in, CNC, send it for 9. I really like that flexibility to Come to Fight over Nimblism. Nimblism, I like it, especially if you're able to keep a 2-card hand that can Nimblism Codex for Leave No Witnesses. But like, there's something about Come to Fight where every single time I played it, I've just been like, wow, this is like really clean. Pre-block is super relevant. It's something I miss on things like Nimblism. Cut to the Chase is just way too narrow, and just like Come to Fight is just nice. And so because of that, we're running a little bit more blues to kind of substantiate this game plan of trying to get these 2 costs, and we're also running Pummel in the list as well, which is really big, and we'll get to that in a second. We're trying to be a little bit more disruptive. We're running some more blue styles. The idea behind these is that it works with our curve. We can stealth swap in aggressively more often than we could with contract, and then at the very least, if our opponent passes on reactions, is sometimes have enough of a relevant on hit that we can actually just pass and then like have it hit, and then sometimes it's actually good enough, right? So if we're keeping a hand here, or let's say we're even bluffing, right, we're just holding something in hand and we send in blue infects, and our opponent doesn't block it with the expectation that we're going to attack react on it, and they're saving a de-react in response, and they pass waiting for us to do it, we can just pass back and then deal 3 essentially, right? Or into some decks like Lexi, for instance, even just playing Blue Wither is already potentially going to be a 0 for 3 or 4. Codex of Bloodrot's kind of interesting. I'm not exactly sure where I land on it yet, but I actually do really like this card as well. The ability to be able to get Death Touch into Arsenal immediately with Tunic up and just send it on the same turn while refunding a card is really good. But the other thing too is that it's just 2 damage that refunds itself. It works on the pitch curve of being able to send these 2 costs, and it also works sending a Dagger. It works stealth swapping in a 2 cost and then pitching it to play Pummel from Arsenal or something like that. But the other thing too is that a really easy counterplay to Uzuri, because of so many of her cards targeting the Arsenal, is just to say, well, I'm just not going to play with it then. I'm losing because I have to protect my Arsenal all the time. I'm just going to find play patterns and adopt my play style to not rely on my Arsenal. Leave No Witnesses is just a 0 for 4. And the nice thing about Codex is that it forces your opponent to play into that anyway. This has come up a lot where my opponent will intentionally play in a way to try not to Arsenal very often, and I just like draw a Codex and then I just play it and then play an Arsenal Disruption, and they just are forced to lose a card immediately from hand and then have to protect it if they want to. The other thing too is when you play the Codex, they don't necessarily have information if there's going to be Arsenal Disruption, so they may not really plan for that when they put the card in. I'm not saying they're going to put their best card in Arsenal, but sometimes you will sometimes put a card in Arsenal that you maybe could imagine saving for an extra turn, things like that. So, I mean, there are ways to play around Codex of Bloodrot, but I do think the card's actually very strong, and I'm trying in the list now. There's a possibility it doesn't stay here forever, but I do like it because this is a list where we're trying to pressure our opponent as much as possible and force as many cards from them, force them to take really poor exchange rates, against us, and this card just works. But going into the rest of the sideboard here, we have a lot of aggro hate, so this is what the deck is kind of inclined to do. So this is a lot different than something like Contract. This one, we're just going hard. We're trying to go second, and we're trying to stop our opponent from playing the game, so cut down the size is really great. You just play any of these stealth cards, and your opponent is just going to pass, expecting, with 4 cards in hand that, unless it's shakedown, they don't really have to worry about anything. And then you swap and cut down the size, and they take 6 and lose a card anyway, right? So we're looking at probably like a 2 card for 9 or a 2 card for 10. Frailty Trap, just insane against Lexi. It'll at the very least be a 0 for 5, if not a 0 for 6, and sometimes a 0 for 7. Humble is really good, right? So these 2 costs can obviously be pummeled, along with Command and Conquer and Shakedown. Shakedown being able to be pummeled is just absolutely game losing for some decks, and it's such a heavy tempo swing, which is also why we're up on the blue count. So with a blue, we can 3 card hand with Tunic for any of these 2 costs plus pummel, and that is just sometimes enough to win a game, and your opponent will never recover from it. Humble's really good. Obviously shuts down Lexi flip, so that can be honestly like pretty much earn losing for Lexi. If you attack into Lexi with, let's say she has 5 cards, her arsenal is face down, and you isolate, let's say you isolate so she can't even play around it, right? And you humble, now she can't flip up her card to use New Horizon for the secondary slot, so it means she either has to burn snaps immediately, or she can only play 1 card and then just pass turn. So that's huge. And then there obviously works against a lot of different heroes. We can go down the list, but you get the idea. It works against a lot of stuff, and for some heroes it's more relevant than others. So Avaya, if that thing hits, she pretty much just loses the game. Katsu loses the ability to tutor, which is really big. We can go on. Think below is just if we need a little bit more of a defensive plan, or if we're playing against a deck with a lot of breakpoints or reaction style based gameplay. Honestly, a lot of this can also be boiled down to sometimes it's better, even into an aggro matchup, to maybe not always put in all of the pummels if you're going first. It's more of a tempo card going second, but honestly it still works anyway, because you can arsenal the pummel if you draw one and you're forced to go first, and then you can just bank on it until you get a good 2 cost card in a blue, and then you can descend it. But there is some consideration of like, if I'm going first into aggro, maybe I want to bring in sync, but if I'm going second into aggro, maybe I want to bring in something else, right? Maybe like a shred. That could be like a very small, minute thing that would come up in your sideboarding strategy. Pummels here in yellow to pitch to a 2 cost, to pitch to bite, but most importantly, to pummel any of our 2 costs here. So you can pummel Surgical, make your opponent lose 2 cards. You can pummel Shakedown, also make your opponent lose 2 cards. You can pummel Command and Conquer, make your opponent lose 2 cards. You get the idea here, right? Works on your other disruptive effects like Humble. Cut down the size is probably not something you're going to pummel, because your opponent's going to be blocking it anyway. But if you want to, it also works there, because since your opponent's going to be blocking, they're probably going to be trying to get their hand size down to a very efficient amount. So if your opponent blocks want to keep 3 cards, they're probably blocking in a way that's like those 3 cards barely function together. And if you pummel and then take 1 more card, that hand may no longer be functional based on the deck you're playing against. I think that having more than yellow pummels might be too much. I started with 9, then went down to 6. Now I'm down to 3, and then we're on yellow shred. So pretty much using these disruptive cards, these reacts in either yellow or in blue here, just to work with the cost curve of the deck. This allows you to pitch these to go bite into a 0 cost or a 1 cost off a Tunic, but also allows you to send some of these 2 cost cards just by themselves without having to use anything else, right? So we're kind of playing around that cost curve as tightly as we can. But yeah, the main goal of the deck is purposely just going to be being proactive with your gameplay and your disruption, which is going to rip cards from your opponent, make you often win on most card economy exchanges. So for instance, if you take a card with a bite, for instance, your opponent full blocks a bite, or if they take a bite and then you play a CNC and your opponent has to block 3 to 1 card, over that long course of the game, 20-30 minutes later, you're going to be up cards in deck because your opponent is just actively having to block with more cards than what you're playing with. Add that in with the secondary game plan of the contract banishes, and you'll end up actually winning a lot of your games through fatigue, just attacking your opponent. It sounds really weird. Fatigue has often been synonymous with defensive game plans, but this is not the case, and hasn't actually been historically. There's been a lot of fatigue decks, like Bravo is the initial proactive fatigue deck, where sending Anothos for 6 every turn eventually rips so many cards that you're supposed to start like blocking 2 cards on the Anothos. If you send a blue 8, for instance, you're supposed to block 3 cards. And then you actually just run out of cards in deck because you just cannot keep up with that card economy exchange where the Bravo player played 1 card from deck, but you lost 3 cards from deck. So that stuff adds up over time. So there's going to be some gameplay on this, so stay tuned for that. But give it a shot. Let me know what you think. If you think this game plan has promise into the upcoming meta. Of course, we don't know what the new Prism or the new Runeblade do, so that's always subject to change. But until next time, thank you for watching.